You're listening to Backbench Drivers. I'm your host, John Lawson, and joining me for the first time this week, I have William McGimpsey. He's a contributor to Reality Check Radio over in New Zealand. He's also a public policy expert, and he's joining us here this week to discuss New Zealand's recent census results, which, as you might expect if you have been following the demographic changes taking place across the Western world, is not looking good. It's not boding well for white New Zealanders. As in the rest of the Western world, they are on the decline as various immigrant and also native non-white groups are growing in size. And this has various ramifications, which I'm sure we're going to dive in today. We're also going to be talking a little bit about Maori race relations over there in New Zealand, which I'm less familiar with, but of course William will take us through that topic. Welcome to the podcast, William.
Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, no, thank you for joining us. So we'll dive right into it. What is the go with the census results over there in New Zealand? What's the situation?
Right. Well, basically, like most white Western Anglosphere countries, New Zealand's becoming less white, more diverse. We're also becoming slightly older. And New Zealand's had a very high immigration rate over the last 10 to 20 years. So I know you guys in Australia, immigration has become a big issue over there. It's a big issue also in the US and the UK and many other countries. But actually, New Zealand's immigration rate has been one of, if not the highest in the Western world. In terms of gross numbers coming into New Zealand, in some years, we're getting over 200,000 people. We're up to near 250,000 gross inflow, which is, we're a population of 5 million people. So that's a 5% increase year on year. So those are gross numbers, not net numbers. If you look back over the last sort of 10 to 20 years, excepting the COVID years where the borders were closed, we have net inflows of 100,000 people or over 100,000 people per year over that period. And so over the last 20 years, we've gained another million people. And over the 30 years previous to that, we gained another million as well. So we've gone very quickly from 3 million to 4 million, and then very quickly from 4 million to 5 million just over the last 20 years. And what this means in terms of our demographics, so New Zealand's traditionally been a bicultural country with a white European majority and a Maori minority. And the Maori minority has floated around a wee bit, but somewhere between 10 to 15% of the population, and the white majority for most of New Zealand's history, or modern history at least, has been around that 85%. But the numbers in the latest, and over previous decades, the white percentage has obviously fallen due to immigration. So in the latest census, the numbers, and one caveat with these ethnic percentages is that the way our statistics department has calculated them is a wee bit misleading, because the percentages don't sum to 100. So if people are are of more than one ethnicity, they're double counting. They're ticking two boxes, and then the stats department is double counting them, so the percentages sum to more than 100. So it makes it very difficult to work out what the real numbers are. But just reporting the numbers that they've reported, the white percentage in New Zealand they're reporting is now 67.8%. The Maori proportion, 17.8%. The Asian proportion, and Asians are a very broad category that includes East Asian, Chinese type people, and like people from the subcontinent, so Indian type people. That percentage is around 17.3%. The Pacific Islander category is about 8.9%. And then we've got this other category in New Zealand called MILA, which is Middle Eastern, Latin American, African. We put them all together in one category. That's about 1.9%. So we've seen significant drops in the white percentage of the population. It's gone from around 85, 90 in 2 or 3 decades, and that's fallen right down to 67.8%. But if you really were to adjust the numbers back to 100% base and take out a lot of the mixed category, I think, based on my own sort of playing around with the numbers, that the actual percentage of the white population would be below 60% in New Zealand at this point. So the way our media has covered that is to hype up the growth in the Maori population. But the Maori population isn't really growing. What they're doing is they're outbreeding. And so the number of people who can cite some ethnic Maori ancestry is growing. And that, because of the way Stats New Zealand's calculating the numbers, that it makes them look bigger. So there's still New Zealand's second largest ethnic category, Maori, at 17.8%. But
can I jump in and just ask you, is there also an incentive for writing down that you are of Maori descent? Like, for example, over here in Australia, there are various benefits to being Aboriginal. So someone adopting that identity for themselves based on only a small percentage of their background being of Indigenous descent is actually, it's sort of encouraged in that way. Is that true over there in New Zealand?
Yeah, kind of. There's a lot of soft benefits to being Maori, and there are some hard financial incentives as well. So the New Zealand's Maori community is divided up into various tribes, or iwi as they're called over here, and iwi often run a number of scholarship programs for their members. And so if you're Maori, you're entitled to various iwi scholarships. And there's also a number of other benefits you can get. You can get easier standards to get into medical school, and there's a number of other things like that. I couldn't rattle off all the advantages off the top of my head. But it is softly encouraged by the media and other people to identify as Maori. And I think that's a large part of what's happening. Maori are the most mixed category in New Zealand. I've looked at the data from previous census, and they used to split out a Maori category from a Maori European combined category, and they were about half each. So about half of, and what they've done in the latest census is they've put the Maori category and the Maori and European mixed category together and just called it all Maori. So they're doing things like that to make the Maori category seem bigger. But the Maori are going to be overtaken by the Asian category in the next few years, because the Asian category is our fastest growing category. We've got a lot of immigration from China, India, the Philippines, countries like this. And so I think my suspicion is that they are aware that Asian is going to overtake Maori, and they're worried about the implications of that for our national identity and for how Maori are going to feel about not even being the second biggest ethnic group in their own country when they're the Indigenous minority. So they're trying to talk up Maori ethnicity and its growth in the media. And
can I ask, is that prospect encouraging nationalist voices to rise to the front of the Maori leadership? Like, I don't know what you call it, the community leadership, or are they becoming more New Zealand in terms of New Zealand nationalistic, border control, immigration restrictionist, etc.?
It's interesting, actually. The Maori community in New Zealand is kind of split. So we have what's called the Maori Party in New Zealand, and they're more a sort of a hard left, a kind of woke Indigenous rights type of party. And recently, actually, they issued a sort of declaration of independence on the same day as their budget, and that, I'm not sure how seriously we should take it, but they're a sort of a radical left, anti-colonial, Maori independence kind of party. But actually, we also have New Zealand First, which is a kind of another part of the current. New Zealand had a new government that came in late last year, and they're part of the coalition government, and they're more of a traditional New Zealand nationalist party that downplays. It doesn't downplay Maori ethnic identity, but it downplays separatism. So the leader of that party, Winston Peters, he very regularly criticises the Maori Party for the separatism, and he wants there to be one New Zealand. He wants us to be one people. And there's a lot of Maori in that party and who back that type of attitude as well. So my feeling is that Maori and New Zealand are kind of split between those two attitudes. Although it's very difficult to say, I haven't really seen any polling on that issue specifically. One thing to think about is this government is the most Maori we've ever had, and it's a right-wing government. We have more Maori MPs and more Maori cabinet ministers in this government than any other government, and yet it's criticised heavily in our media for being anti-Maori. And part of the reason for that is a big issue in our election campaign. We just got rid of Jacinda Ardern, which I'm sure Australians have some familiarity with who she is and what she did. But one of the things that she did that was very unpopular, she introduced this policy called co-governance, which is really about giving Maori extra rights and extra say in an undemocratic way on our local councils. They wanted to introduce Maori wards where you could only vote for Maori candidates, so that the Maori part of the population got to vote for Maori candidates. And they introduced a whole lot of other reforms that favoured Maori. They wanted to sell off the water assets in New Zealand that the local councils own and put them under a governorship arrangement that was heavily influenced and controlled by the local iwi organisations, the tribal Maori organisations. And so we had a lot of this sort of thing going on as well, a lot of policies that favoured Maori. And that was one of the key issues that helped the new coalition government get into power, a kind of backlash against that sort of Maori ethnic chauvinism, ethnic activism type politics.
It sounds very similar to the US as opposed to Australia. Obviously, our Aboriginal minority is very small, and although it's given a lot of, I guess, symbolic power, and although it does complicate the running of government in various ways, it seems like in New Zealand, it's more equivalent to the US, where you have a more sizable minority that has a longest, I guess, more of an attachment to the country in some ways. So even your right-wing governments have to sort of include them in that way. Whereas over here, our most right-wing politicians, they sort of, they can brand themselves as totally eschewing all of the Aboriginal identity stuff, saying we don't want any of that involvement. I suppose because it's a smaller voting bloc, less of a cultural stake I mean, the government does try to force Aboriginal culture, and so do all of our major media institutions into the public sphere. But because people don't interact with Aboriginals that much, and they don't have members of their family who are Aboriginal many times, it just doesn't latch, it seems, as much as with New Zealand or in the US. And following on from that, do you see the same problems as in the US with the race relations between white and Maori? I know you said some of them are like Winston Peters, and they're proud of the country and they want to advocate for its interests. But apart from that, is there a general animosity between the two within culture, within behaviour, even within institutions, or is there generally a more harmonious relationship?
Well, I think for most of our history, I would say, and maybe I'm not the best historian ever, but for most of our history, I would say European and Maori got along better than a lot of other ethnic minorities and colonial settler populations. The British settlers made several statements to the effect that Maori were the finest native population in the world, like things like this. And we have gotten along quite well. But in recent years, we've seen the importation of what I would call like woke grievance politics that you see in the US, and the Maori Party is an expression of that in New Zealand. So they're doing that, all the anti-colonial stuff and the woke stuff, and decrying the settlers and the colonialists, and pulling down the statues and encouraging all this type of thing. But prior to that, I think we'd gotten along quite well. We have this sort of tradition in New Zealand. We have Waitangi Day every day that commemorates the the Treaty of Waitangi, which is kind of our founding document. It was a treaty signed between one at the British Crown and Maori. And we commemorate that every year. And it's kind of the annual bust-up between Maori and the government, where the Maori protest and they get riled up and they ask for things about their treatment and stuff. But I mean, apart from that, for most of our history, the relations have been relatively harmonious, and it seems to have been getting worse in recent years because of this importation of woke grievance politics from the US.
So there is sort of a prospect of Maori and white New Zealanders working together to restore the previous, or I guess even a couple decades prior demographic makeup of the country, and rolling it back from what it is today. You say you've got the growing Asian minority. You also have a small, but I assume growing Black Middle Eastern minority as well. Do you see much prospect of the immigration from these countries being cut off in order to slow the demographic changes, or even possibly a reversal?
I mean, I think in the medium to longer term, there is hope for that. I mean, I note that immigration has gone from being a taboo subject to being the central subject of political conversation in both the US and now also in the UK. And New Zealand's a bit behind on that. I think we're probably behind Australia as well. Immigration wasn't a central feature of our last election for the coalition government, even though our rates of immigration are probably the highest in the Western world, or at least among the highest. Certainly higher than the UK, and the US is a bit hard to figure out because you've got so much illegal immigration, but we're higher rates than the UK and equal to or higher than Australia. But it wasn't such a big issue for us. But there are people who are starting to make noises about immigration in New Zealand, including recently Shane Jones, who's a member of the government of the New Zealand First Party, led by Winston Peters, that I was discussing earlier. And he made a public statement in an interview to the effect that he's worried about Maori's place in New Zealand. When the New Zealand's population reaches 7 million in 2040 or 2050, or whenever that's forecast to happen, because then there'll be a much smaller proportion of the population. So that's one New Zealand politician who has made comments like that. And I think, that if I was to use my crystal ball, I would say that as immigration's become a bigger issue in most other, especially Anglosphere countries, it will over time become a bigger issue in New Zealand, and more politicians will start making comments like that as well. That would be my forecast, but of course, that's just a prediction.
Well, with such drastically high levels, like you're talking about, equivalent to Australia, over here we're experiencing many practical effects of not necessarily the changing demography yet, although that does have some ramifications for our country. Even at the moment, even though it's only a minor a problem at the moment. But the larger difficulties for us are sort of the load-bearing capacity of our land. So that means that our water supply is running low as we have more people consuming water all people consume water. But as more people come to the country and the population shatters all records, we're having trouble, getting enough water. We're having trouble in terms of housing supply. That's been probably the biggest issue. We're having trouble in terms of wage growth, rent, and various other aspects as well. Do you think that these practical effects will allow the immigration topic to enter the conversation in New Zealand and become mainstream? Because that's certainly what's happening over here.
Yes, I think so. We've had a housing crisis for a couple of decades now that neither the right-wing or the left-wing parties have been able to solve. And we have an infrastructure deficit, so our infrastructure spending can't keep up. We have stretched public services. And these are the same issues they're having in the UK that Nigel Farage and others are making a big deal about. But the problem in New Zealand is none of our leading economists or experts have connected the dots between these problems and the immigration rate. And I feel like actually I'm a lone voice on social media trying to trying to point out the links between a very high immigration rate and our housing crisis, our infrastructure deficit, and our stretched public services. Now, I think it'll come. I think we will get recognition that it's the immigration rate that's driving those problems over time. But people haven't connected the dots in New Zealand on those issues. So that's something that's holding it back in New Zealand.
Okay. Yeah, well, it is definitely a major step once that dam has been broken. Over here, I'm seeing lots of promising steps being made ever since um, the topic started to be allowed to be discussed, which seems to have been, I think, after Albanese allowed in our current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, for New Zealand listeners, allowed in such a flood after COVID of immigration, and it was actually record beating in many ways in terms of the number of people being admitted. It actually, I think it exceeded even people's very high tolerance for immigration, because obviously the conversation is gatekept at the moment by threats of being called racist and being outside of the political norm. I think by Albanese coming out and inadvertently legalizing the conversation, not obviously legalizing it, but making it okay for people to talk about the practical aspects, we've sort of started an arms race of immigration restrictionism. So after that, you had the Liberal Party, which is our major right-wing party, supposedly right-wing, conservative centre party. They came out and now they're outdoing the Labor government on their promises of immigration restriction. And then our minor right-wing party, populist right-wing party, which once again has been lackluster for a couple decades, but was founded on the promise of immigration restriction. Now they're coming out and they're even using rhetoric such as remigration, and they're talking about replacement migration. And so it seems that we've started a little bit of a spiral upwards, hopefully, in terms of outdoing each other, or the different parties trying to outdo each other in terms of how restrictionist they can be. And it seems to be something that's starting in the UK. There's always been a lot of popular sentiment in the UK against allowing in such drastically different populations and at such high rates. But it seems only now with Nigel Farage are they getting a reasonable political representation that will be able to affect change on the issue, or at least normalize it. In the US, of course, there was the Trump revolution, which placed illegal immigration, although not legal immigration, at the center of its campaign in 2016. And but it has grown softer over time. It seems that we're entering the cycle perhaps about 5 to 10 years later than everyone else over here in Australia, and I imagine New Zealand will follow on from that. I think the challenge will be from here is that we don't allow what happened in the US with Trump to happen over here in Australia. There's always the threat, and in New Zealand as well, there's always the threat that the popular sentiment against mass immigration will be weaponized as a simple vote winner, but not actually then be converted into policy changes and into actually reducing the numbers and trying to restore our demography back to, a couple decades ago when our country was more stable and we had a homogenous population. How do you think that we can stop such a devolution in the rhetoric in the anti-immigration cause happening over here when inevitably we reach that stage?
Well, I think what you've pointed out there around the dam breaking in terms of political correctness, that's the real positive development that's enabled these conversations to happen and put immigration on the map as an issue. So for the longest time, Western populations, including in Australia and New Zealand, have lived under this Orwellian thought control system of political correctness, where you're not allowed to say anything that might be considered racist or sexist or homophobic or xenophobic or anti-Semitic or all the rest of it. And the problem with that is there's a lot of legitimate debates around public policy that can be characterized as falling under those labels. And in the past, that's just resulted in those issues not having any coverage in the media and not being subjected to any real discussion. And what I would say about that is, do you really have is your democracy really legitimate if people can't and don't debate and discuss really important issues like major demographic changes happening to the country. If that's off limits for discussion, is it a legitimate democracy? But anyway, with the with the Brexit vote, and then with Trump especially, there's just something about Trump that he's just such a presence, and just something about the way he talks that he's blown political correctness out of the water. That's how I think about it anyway. And while he might not have done anything practically to reduce the immigration, he's at least allowed, created the space by bulldozing political correctness for everyone to start talking about the issue to the extent where it's now in America. I think, if not the top issue people are talking about, it's one of the top issues. But yeah, I mean, you raised an important point. In America, that is a risk where we have the issue and people can talk about the issue, but it doesn't really get solved. That the right-wing parties might decide they'd rather have the issue to galvanize support to get people to vote for them than rather do anything about it to fix it. And I don't have any real solutions to that except to keep the pressure on to make sure that things like that don't happen. And what you're seeing in the UK now is the destruction of the Conservative Party. People have decided really to punish the Conservative Party for their betrayal on immigration. And so I think that sort of tactical voting is perhaps one option that we have. If our Conservative parties refuse to do anything about immigration, we can not vote for them. Vote for third parties like the Reform Party in the UK, or perhaps other options that come up elsewhere.
Yeah, that is certainly part of the equation. I still do fear that the public's apathy on these issues is going to be a big problem, because in some ways it's understandable. The topics that we talk about are very, I suppose, they're not imminent in some ways, because you're talking about demographic changes that might take decades to actually come into effect, or that we might not see the results of for a very long time. You start to see some results, and they do start to trickle in, but by then it's almost too late to really see any change, to make changes. For example, you start to see the degradation of certain suburbs. You'll see a mass population come in from a third world country, and they'll congregate within certain suburbs. That suburb starts to look more and more like back home where they came from, and that means that the living conditions decrease. You start to see food hygiene standards drop. You start to see people ignoring the law and acting as they would back in their home country once again. And but then what happens is the white population in Australia, and I'm sure in New Zealand as well, and across the Western world, they take part in a ritual which some have called white flight, meaning that they basically move out of the area. They don't look at the problem anymore, and they can live peacefully, ignoring the problems elsewhere in a different suburb that hasn't been affected by demographic change. And really, the only way to see the bigger picture, and for ordinary people to see the bigger picture, is to then go on government stats and look up census data like you've done here and like you're presenting to us, and say, well, hang on a second, my portion of the population is shrinking. And if we look to history, once again, another sort of nebulous concept for the general population, we can see that minorities generally don't fare well under the rule of people that some would say, treated badly, but certainly have an animosity towards them for perceived or real historical grievances. It's not necessarily a practical topic. What's one way that we can make it more imminent for people, and or do you think that's naturally going to happen as a consequence of demographic change anyway?
I think it will naturally happen. And one of the good books that I read in the past 5 to 10 years, I'm going to struggle to remember the title, but it was something called National Populism by some UK scholars, Matt Goodwin and Roger Eatwell. And their conclusion was that, mass immigration is driving a lot of problems in Western societies. And as long as the mass immigration keeps up, the intensity of the problems is going to also keep up. And we've talked about a few. We've talked about, housing crises, infrastructure deficits, stretched public services, but it also creates ethnic tension and ethnic strife. Your politics sort of devolves from being a conversation of ideas around what the best public policies are to secure the common good or something like that, into a sort of war between competing ethnic or other group interests, where there is really no such, well, if there is a common good, people don't consider it. People are just trying to get what they can for their group and their interests. So politics has become more divisive. This is driving a lot of the call for hate speech laws, in my view. It's a desire by the powers that be to kind of put a lid on the ethnic conflict, so get people not talking about it, which is really the opposite of what we need to do to solve the problem. We need to talk about it so we can stop the immigration policy that's causing the problem to start with. But that's my general view, is that as long as the policy of mass immigration continues, the problems associated with it will intensify, and that will cause, naturally, people to start trying to do something about it. They'll get together, they'll get involved in politics, they'll get involved in social media, and this is exactly what we're seeing. They'll form organizations, lobby groups, advocacy organizations, to try and push back against the changes. And that process will only intensify, I think, the longer these problems go on. The question is, and this remains up in the air for me, you may well have this great intensity of feeling. You may well build these institutions, these advocacy groups, build these structures of power, but will they ultimately be able to reverse it by implementing policies like remigration? Whether that's actually going to be possible or not, I mean, I guess everything's ultimately possible, but whether that will actually happen or not remains uncertain for me. So it may be the case that we end up having really multicultural countries where white people are a minority, and maybe even a dwindling minority, but yet they have more power in a way, because the process of becoming a minority has sort of activated them. It's antagonized them. They've got together, they've built these institutions. They have the ability to project power within these multicultural countries in a peaceful and democratic way. And that could be the end point rather than remigration. However, you can't rule out remigration completely either. That it's also possible. So I don't know how it's going to turn out.
Yeah, certainly. It's interesting to see the people within government who think that they can actually police people's thoughts and speech, and they can pull out all stops in order to do so. They can go to any means. Seem to think it's difficult to simply say no to people who would like to come into the country, and also send people back who have only been here for a short time. It always seems to be one way, any means, any ends is possible, and then on the other way, nothing is possible. We can't even make the slightest attempt, and anything is doomed to fail. We're often told this about policies such as immigration restriction and remigration. But I think going further from what you said about generally we need to be talking to people, and also becoming, I think, start thinking from the frame of a minority, as we soon will be within our own countries, and start working our way into positions of power. And I suppose one way you could do this is in New Zealand. You've got the very impressive New Zealand First Party, which has forged ahead of many other countries, which you would expect, for example, in the US, to be ahead of it in terms of rhetoric and in terms of policy, securing the nation from mass immigration and from various other threats, and also, safeguarding New Zealand culture in some ways. I know that they've put through a bill, I think, for English language uses, and to safeguard that as the national language of New Zealand. And I think that it would be very positive for people who do understand what's going on, the big picture within our countries, that is the demographic change, to go into these parties and then try to shape them even more to our worldview, and try to make them more truthful and more strident in their opposition. Do you see that happening, particularly with New Zealand First over there? Do you see a lot of people who are on our side of politics joining up and making sure the party goes to higher heights than it is at the moment, or is it a flash in the pan?
Well, I can't really comment. I mean, I'm not party to the who's joining up to New Zealand First, but I know I've been to a few of their rallies and public meetings, and they do get a lot of support into their rallies and public meetings. So I would anticipate that that would translate to more memberships and more people signing up and people moving in as well. I think the real development that I see in New Zealand is on the sort of the advocacy group side of things, and this is where I work at the moment. So I work with various types of advocacy groups behind the scenes, often trying to help them with their social media and also with their their submission writing, their campaign writing, trying to interact with government consultation processes. So my thinking on this is that there's a lot of people are becoming activated. There's a lot of people doing kind of political activism of a sort on social media, and really the challenge is to harness the energy that they have and to channel it to make it more effective. And I've worked in advocacy groups before. I have really basic skills about how to interact with government consultation processes and run campaigns. And I've also been a policy wonk, worked in the government on the other side of it, so I know how things work from that perspective. And so this is what I see developing. I see more happening in the right-wing advocacy space. Groups are getting together, groups are forming, they're developing lists of members, mailing lists. More people are willing to donate to these causes, which is always important, so you can pay people to do the work. And as long as the challenges of immigration and other related policies exist, then that the motivation for that kind of building of institutions, building of networks, consolidation and projection of power, that will continue as long as the policies prompting it continue.
Well, that's definitely a positive thing to hear. It's important not to tie all of our hopes into one single organization or figure, as in we've seen that with Trump, where he sort of became the central figure within the anti-immigration debate, within right-wing spheres as well. And unfortunately, he seems to have disappointed in many ways. He didn't live up to the promise that he made in 2016. And although there are lots of good people within the administration, unfortunately, there aren't enough. Now, over in the UK, let's maybe shift our focus over there. We've got Nigel Farage, who has, it seems that he's having a lot of success. The polling is showing that he's polling ahead of various Tory figures, Conservative, which is the mainstream Conservative party over there in the UK. And this is very promising because he's, of course, much stronger in his opposition to mass migration and illegal immigration compared to the Conservatives, which have, although they've often weaponized anti-immigration rhetoric to win the vote and to win support and get high polling numbers, they haven't delivered any successes or victories for the anti-immigration right-wing side. He's way ahead of the Tories on that, and it seems like there are a lot of people within the Reform Party, or at least I've heard word on the street, there are a lot of good people that do understand the whole picture that are in the Reform Party and are going to help to take things further. What do you see as the prospects for Nigel? Do you think that he actually will clean sweep the Tories in this election?
Probably. I think he probably will. It's hard to say exactly, but I mean, there's a recent poll that shows him with that shows the Reform Party within 2 points of the Conservative Party nationwide in the UK. That would have them taking over as the main opposition party if things continue on that trajectory. The other thing that's happened recently is that there's a couple of other things that the Labour Party in the UK has started specifically targeting its attack ads on Nigel Farage rather than the Tories. And of course, that's an indication that they see him as the major threat rather than the Conservative Party. And it's also likely to generate more support for Nigel Farage. This is the phenomenon we saw in the US with Trump, where the more they sort of attacked him and pointed out how awful, more the media pointed out how awful they thought he was, the stronger he grew, so to speak. And so I can see something similar to that starting to happen in the UK, although it's very early. But I think something like that may happen. I also saw an announcement today, Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives saying, they don't have enough money for their to wage a proper social media advocacy campaign during the election. So if that's the case, that's pretty hopeless, and they're going to go down the gurgler a lot on the basis of that as well. So I think things are looking good for Nigel Farage. I would anticipate that he gets a higher proportion of the vote than the Conservatives. But of course, this is all really guesswork, and I could be wrong, and things can always change. But that's the trajectory I see it on at the moment.
Yeah, the first past the post electoral system, which they have in the UK, can sometimes be a bit unpredictable in that way. But I think the phenomenon that you're talking about is absolutely correct, where you have people that are supposedly opposed to each other, whether they be Republicans and Democrats, Liberal and Labor over here in Australia or in the UK. I think you've got sort of three major parties. You have the Liberals, you have the Conservative Tories, and you have Labor as well. And it's something that Jonathan Bowden noted back when the BNP was more of a fixture, the British National Party, that all these parties which were supposedly opposed to each other and at each other's throats a lot of the rest of the time would all unite and go against the BNP whenever they shared a stage or shared a debate platform. And it was as though they were all on the same team against the truly radical outsider. And I think that's happening a little bit with Nigel over in the UK. It used to be more of the case with Trump, but unfortunately he became more establishment friendly over time, and that certainly has reduced the attacks on him. The Republicans basically are fully in support of him nowadays. In New Zealand, it's a little bit of a different case. It seems like Winston Peters doesn't quite get the same amount of attacks on him as Trump ever did, or the BNP ever did. He seems to be really straddling the line in between pushing for very effective solutions and also being friendly with the rest of the establishment. Do you think that this is the sort of path that we should be pursuing here? Do you think it's more productive to be friendly to the establishment, at least outwardly, and then pushing effective policy? Or do you think it's more important that rhetoric and the radical elements be made known to the public, and meanwhile you're also hopefully pushing through a lot of successful stuff on the back end, although that hasn't always been the case?
Well, that's a complex question. I think on the left, they are able to be successful without necessarily constantly disavowing the radical fringe that's associated with them. Whereas the conservative parties for the last 50 years in most other countries have made a concerted effort and made a big show of disavowing the radical elements to their right. So if you just judge it by the pure effectiveness of those various policies, you'd have to say that the constant disavows to the right haven't really worked for conservative parties. But I mean, the reason for that may be just because of the overwhelming media support or media bias to the left that occurs in most left-wing countries. But what we can see now is with social media that bias problem is starting to even out, because although the large conventional media companies still lean to the left, social media, Twitter and other avenues is forming a larger and larger proportion of the market in terms of where people get their news and their opinion and their analysis. And a lot of voices on those platforms come more from the right when they provide different perspectives. and that's helping to even the media playing field. In terms of Winston Peters, I'd say a few things about what he's got working for him that works well for him. So the first one is he's been around in New Zealand a long time. He's probably, I think at this point, he would be our longest serving politician, although I could be wrong. Way back, we had a Muldoon government in the 1970s, and he was Rob Muldoon's a famous sort of populist right-wing politician. We had right-wing populism in New Zealand. We kind of invented it. We had it long before they had it. Before we had people like Trump. And Winston Peters was the person that Rob Muldoon thought should lead New Zealand's National Party, which is our major conservative party, after he retired. However, Winston got in a bust-up with Jim Bolger, the people who took over the National Party after Rob Muldoon, because of a disagreement over sort of neoliberal economic policies. So Winston is more of an old school, conservative, economic nationalist type politician, as opposed to endorsing the neoliberal direction that came in from Reagan, Thatcher, and our fourth Labour government in New Zealand. So Winston has in his favour that he's been around a long time and everyone knows him, and everyone's kind of used to him. He's kind of Trump-like, but everyone's been used to him in New Zealand for a long time. The other thing he's got going for him is he's a Maori. And one of the facts about politics is if you're an Indigenous minority, people let you away with saying provocative, politically incorrect things. And this is particularly, you can see how effective this is when Winston Peters is criticising the Maori Party. So he's arguably New Zealand's biggest critic of the Maori Party, but he's a Maori himself, and that gives him enormous power and enormous leeway to make the really cutting but true criticisms that probably need to be made, but would get a lot of other people who are white called a racist if they dared to make them. So that's very helpful for him. The other thing is his party is a centrist party in New Zealand. So he's made a point of, at times, doing coalition deals with our Labour Party on the left and at other times our National Party on the right. And so it makes it harder to demonise his views, even though he does have socially conservative views and anti-immigration views and sort of economic nationalist views. It makes it much harder to demonise him as far right if he's constantly doing deals with the Labour Party and the National Party and selling himself effectively as a centrist. So those are some factors that are counting in favour of Winston Peters. Perhaps some things we can learn from him. Sell yourself as a centrist. Be willing to do deals with either the left or right. And if you're part of an Indigenous minority yourself, you get more leeway to make the telling criticisms that need to be made. Also, if you're a respected figure and you've been around a long time, that gives you a lot of ability to do things that other people can't.
Yeah, perhaps we need to find an Aboriginal spokesman for the, pro-white anti-immigration cause over here in Australia. We can get similar results. But I agree. I think that we really have to favour substance over form. We've seen sort of the difference between Trump. He did do a lot of benefit in the public conversation, but unfortunately in the halls of power, it just didn't translate. Now, I think it is possible to do both. I think maybe an example would be perhaps Pauline Hanson at the start when she first founded One Nation. She's grown a lot more watered down over time, but at the beginning she was definitely she spoke very strongly about the anti-immigration cause, about the demographic change, while also growing a political party and pulling the coalition, the national and liberal coalition over here to the right on that. For example, she started a mini competition between her and the Liberal Party Prime Minister then, John Howard, in terms of who could be more right-wing on their rhetoric. Still, that didn't exactly translate into policy changes. Instead, John Howard, he was very strict on illegal immigration, but he let in record numbers of legal migration at the time, and also from very diverse countries at that. And he really ramped up multiculturalism in that way, while at the same time being seen as one of the most immigration restrictionist prime ministers, one of the most right wing prime ministers we've had in a long time. And so yeah, I have to agree with the Winston Peters sort of position, because although he doesn't seem as inflammatory, and although he does still speak truth, and he does still tell it as it is,
I
he
think
has
if you were to ask our media, they would tell you he is very
he is
inflammatory. I mean,
inflammatory. Yeah, I suppose,
yeah.
but you would say that he hasn't quite elicited the same sort of furor over there as the AfD in Germany, for example, or Trump in America. He seems to still, and he is part of the ruling coalition, as in he's made peace with the major conservative parties in some ways, which we saw the elements of the Republican Party, which were opposed to Trump. They sort of they had to, at the very beginning, they sort of flamed up, and they left at that, and he was very stringent in attacking them back then. um, Also in the UK, you could say the same thing, a similar thing with the BNP, which was they would never quite incorporate it or accept it as part of the mainstream. Whereas over in New Zealand, it does seem Winston Peters does get things done, and he does make deals with the major institutions. Because of course he's in a coalition with, I forget the names, but the two other major uh, centre right conservative parties, and he's been normalised in that way. I think, for example, you could talk about Winston Peters over here in Australia, and he wouldn't be treated in the same way as talking about a Trump or Enoch Powell or someone like that. But do you agree, or do you still think that he's the most radical you've had in a while?
Well, because he's been around so long, saying the same things, being in and out of government, it's hard for us to think of him as radical, I guess. I mean, he's always been unpopular and controversial. People haven't liked his stances on immigration and any number of other things. But the fact that he's been around and been in power for such a long time, sort of, I don't know, that it kind of inoculates people against the idea that he's radical and scary and unacceptable to a certain extent. I guess it's just, like if you're there and you've actually been part of the government, it's harder for people to use the scare tactics because you've been there before and the sky didn't fall. So I guess that's a large part of it.
Yeah, fair enough. I suppose the media's never going to let someone off lightly when they do go against this the mass immigration agenda, which has it basically has universal mainstream support. So yeah, I guess it must just be a factor of people getting used to it, because yeah,
Yeah, and
you're right.
he's got a lovable rogue kind of character to him, which I
Right,
guess
fair
Trump
enough.
has too. But I mean, it's hard to, as much as the media has a go at him, and it's very hard to call someone racist if they're a Maori, and
Mm.
that's the other part of it. But he's got this lovable rogue character that, and a lot of people appreciate it, and a lot of people dislike the media, and the more he criticizes the media, the more they like him.
Sort of
So
reminds me of Bob Catter. Bob Catter is very, although he doesn't have quite the amount of power as Winston Peters, he hasn't been quite as conventionally successful. He's got fairly right wing policy positions, but because he's a lovable larrikin, and he's a very original character, he can get away with a lot more. Like even left wing people get a kick out of him. They enjoy that. But of course, like in terms of policy, he's quite right wing, and he even made the Proud Boys pledge at one point and things like this. But for some reason, everyone in the country can universally just, they seem to just like him. You can't really not like the guy. But yeah, it seems like you're describing a similar thing with Winston Peters. So I
yeah, and
guess
he
that's the
makes
root.
like brilliant speeches in the House. I mean, he's one of the best speakers that we have in
Mm.
our politics, and he makes these amazing cutting speeches that tear people to shreds, and he's good at doing that on the campaign trail as well. Great to listen to. I mean, if you're into that sort of political rhetoric.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we covered a lot of good topics here. We covered how immigration, how it is changing our countries, and some of the impacts that's going to have in terms of race relations, and also practical things, or more practical things, such as housing supply, etc. And we talked about some of the solutions and also preventing the derailing. I think that brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you for joining us this week, William. Your insight, I think it's very valuable. Could you please share with the audience where they can find more of your work if they'd like to?
The main place you can catch up with me is on Twitter or X. I post under my own name, William McGimpsey, and the handle is at the Zeitgeist NZ. Apart from that, there's also a fledgling YouTube account called The Zeitgeist, where I post my podcast appearances.
I'll share all those links down in the description, so make sure you head down there and click them, subscribe, follow William everywhere you can find him, and also follow the nationalobserver.co. That's where you can find all of our podcasts and also articles. We have one article and one podcast a week, generally, on a normal week. And it's always good value, I think. It's free, so you can't say no. So that's thenationalobserver.co. Go check that out. Also follow us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere else you can find us, X as well, Telegram. So that's it. Thank you very much for joining me, William. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks for having me on.